Hello, and welcome to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. Each month, Red Bank Humanists hosts a public forum featuring speakers and topics covering a wide range of subjects of special interest to the humanist community. To learn more, including information about our monthly book club and our Drinking Post-Theologically events, visit redbankhumanists.org and follow us on Twitter at Red Bank Humanists.
Today's speaker, Dave Moscato, is a writer, blogger, public speaker, and activist for the secular movement. He was the writing intern and volunteer network coordinator in the Kansas-Missouri region for the Secular Student Alliance. He has appeared in Rolling Stone, People, and Time magazines, the New York Times, and on NPR, MSNBC, ABC, and Howard Stern. He is a member of the American Federation of Musicians, American Mensa, the Secular Coalition for America, the Secular Student Alliance, the Society for Economic Anthropology, and the American Anthropological Association. Recently, in February, Dave took the position of Public Relations Director for the American Atheists, taking over the post from Teresa McBain, who you'll remember spoke to us last year about her journey from faith to atheist. And I think Hemant Mehta, also known as the Friendly Atheist, said it right on Dave becoming the Public Relations Director when he wrote in his blog, "It's very exciting and deeply satisfying to see a former campus atheist group leader getting a quote-unquote real job in the atheist world. There are all sorts of opportunities for Christians to do that, becoming a pastor, youth group leader, adult leader at a college Christian group, etc. But we're only starting to see the growth of positions as a professional atheist. As these organizations grow, they'll start to hire more staffers, and many of them will likely come from the ranks of atheists who help their college groups." So please give a warm welcome to David Moscato.
Thanks for having me, everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to speak for you. So I'm just going to jump right in. This talk is called Keys to Effective Discussion, How to Talk Religion Without Pissing People Off. I'm going to start off with just what I hope to accomplish here today. One of the things that I want to do is help you improve your effectiveness in just day-to-day conversations about atheism and religion. This talk isn't so much about formal debates. I do another talk about that. If you guys are interested in that, I'd be happy to come back and give it. But this is really about how to talk religion with your coworkers or with your neighbors or friends or just anybody else who might be religious who's interested in this sort of thing. I want to help you be a better representative of atheism in general. Sometimes when you're talking to people, religious people who tend to kind of isolate themselves into groups of religious people, you might be the only out atheist or non-theist that they know personally, and it's not really fair, but they might think of you as a representative of all atheists. And it's important to keep in mind that you, as a representative of all of us, what you say and what you do and how you dress and so on reflects on the rest of the crowd. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I hope you learned something today. So we're going to start with a couple of definitions. A discussion, this is what we're going to be talking about today. This is an informal, unstructured exchange of ideas. Participants address each other directly, and it can be ongoing. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one session. I have many ongoing discussions right now over email with people that have lasted for weeks. They ask me something, and I send them something to read, and then they ask a question, and then I respond to it, and so on. The goal in a discussion is to convince the other person that you're talking to understand and see your point of view on this, as opposed to a debate where you're addressing the audience and not necessarily trying to convince your opponent to change their mind directly. A discussion is not a quarrel, although debates and quarrels often arguments and quarrels, often people mix up those terms. A quarrel is a disagreement between two people who ordinarily get along, and that's not what we want. Contrast that with an argument. An argument is it's a formally defined term in logic. which is a series of premises followed by a conclusion. So when I use the term argument today, that's what I'm talking about. I don't mean people verbally fighting. So as I mentioned before, debate is a formal, structured discussion. Usually you have a moderator, it's timed, you have a schedule of opening statements and then rebuttals and so on, which is not what this talk is about again. So as far as informal debates, aka discussions, here's some advice about how to do that. One of the main things that helps is to be patient. If you are used to talking about these things, which just living in a country where the majority of people are not atheists, if it becomes apparent in conversation that you are one, people want to talk about it sometimes, and not necessarily voluntarily, you end up having the same conversations over and over and over with people you come across who aren't atheists. And the important thing to keep in mind when I say be patient is that just because you've explained something 100 times as far as evolution or the origin of the universe or anything like that, or how can you be moral without a God, that doesn't mean that the person you're talking to has ever heard this explained before. So you want to keep that in mind when you're talking to this person. Be kind. I like etymology, but kind, it comes from the Nordic word for kin, like family. And what I mean by that is think of the person that you're talking to as a close friend, as a family member, even if it's not somebody you know well. It'll just help you be more honest and straightforward with them, and think of them as your partner in this discussion, not as your debate opponent. It's important to let them speak. You should be listening the majority of the time when you're having a discussion about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that later, but you want to let them explain what they believe and why they believe what they believe, and let them work out why they're wrong, just using nudging questions from you. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, as opposed to just explaining your position. But don't let them, what I call machine gun. Machine gunning is where somebody moves on to a new argument, one after the other, and you see theists do this quite a bit. They'll start one argument, like how can you be moral without a God? And then you explain through, evolution created morals in cooperative species because it helps pass on our genes better or whatever. And right when they get to the point where they understand and they're about to concede that point and say, oh, I guess that makes sense. Well, I won't ever bring that up in discussions about religion again. Now that I get it, I'm not going to argue that doesn't make sense. Right before they get to that point of conceding it, they'll say, well, where did the universe come from if there's no God? And it's like, if they try to do that, you have to say, before we move on to a new point, I'd like you to, if you understand this, to concede the point and say, I understand that we're not going to use that point again, not just with me, but with anyone now that you get it. If you don't completely understand it, then allow me to explain in a different way, because the goal here is to have them understand what you're saying. So if you use a term in your discussion, God or miracle or supernatural or origin or something like that, create, ask them what they understand it to mean. Don't just assume that they understand what these mean. If you're talking about, like, for example, evolution, it's my experience that a lot of people who believe in God don't understand the difference between evolution and speciation. They don't necessarily know what an allele is, and just things like that. And if you start talking about why, natural selection is true, they might not understand what you mean. So you have to explain to them what that means to you, and so that you can have a shared understanding. And similarly, if you're talking about things like God, if they're understanding God to be something quite specific, and then they start defending deism or something like that, you want to make sure that you're arguing the same thing, so that you don't disprove something that doesn't change their mind because it's not what they think. And same thing, if you use a term, then you want to define it clearly, not just ask them to do that. Use appropriate body language. I'm going to skip some of this, but there's a lot of things that you can do to pay attention just in cultural anthropology. You study this kind of stuff as far as when people cross their arms, that means that they're defensive and they feel like they're being attacked, or they're cold. It makes a difference, because if you're outside and it's cold and they do that, you might think that they're feeling defensive when they're just cold. But in Western cultures, we have a tendency to nod our heads up and down. to signal agreement with somebody. We also do that to show that we're listening, and it's unfortunate that we use the same signal for both, because we can accidentally communicate that we're agreeing with somebody when we just intend to communicate that we understand what they're saying. So what I like to do, and with hat tip to Greta Christina for this, is to tilt your head like that to show that you understand what they're saying and you're listening, but you don't necessarily, oh, okay, I agree with them. So I'm not going to get into scripture much at all today, but there's one verse that I think is worth memorizing, and it's 1 Peter 3:15. If you're talking to a Christian, which is the majority of religious people in the United States, this one is worth knowing, and it says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. So if somebody starts to get upset with you or angry with you, or they don't want to give you a straight answer, you can remind them that their own holy book tells them that if somebody asks you for this, then they are supposed to tell you their actual reasoning for believing it, and be kind and respectful about that to that person. I mean, if they don't want to talk about it, obviously, don't harass them. But if you have a question, they are supposed to answer you and talk to you about it. There's some people who make the argument that having these kinds of discussions one-on-one is a waste of time. They would rather do this in writing through blogs or by making videos or having public debates, because it's more efficient to talk to more people in that forum. One-on-one is not a waste of time. It is actually very effective. It's not as efficient, but there's a reason that missionaries go door to door and that churches spend money sending people out to do that. The reason they do it is because it works extremely well in changing people's minds to be able to ask questions directly and get a direct answer like that. When you're talking to somebody about this stuff, if you don't know them already, like a neighbor, offer them further resources about websites, Talk Origins or the God Delusion or whatever. So yes, offer further resources and get their contact information so that you can follow up. A lot of times, if you just give them your number and say, if you have any questions, I'm happy to continue this conversation. Even if they continue to look into it, you might think that it was a waste of time for you, because changing your mind about religion it's not an instantaneous thing. It's extremely rare that somebody becomes unreligious in a single discussion. I've seen it happen, but it's pretty rare, and it's usually because they were almost there anyway. But I think one of the major reasons that people think one-on-one is a waste of time is because it's, for some people a months-long process or a 5-year process or a 20-year process. And if you don't hear back from them about their progress on that, you might think that it didn't do anything. But it's about, I hate to say this, steal from the Bible, but it's about planting seeds and helping people think about this sort of thing. So, okay. So let's briefly look at some additional advice here. Don't bring up an argument unless you know it pretty well. Obviously, if the other person brings up the argument first, then it's okay to discuss it. If you don't know an argument and they bring it up, it's okay to say, I don't really know very much about that enough to defend it properly. Let's go find a biology professor, somebody who can answer your question. But if somebody says, like, well, where did the universe come from if there's no God? And you haven't really, looked into that, read the Grand Design or read Universe from Nothing or something, and you're not prepared to give them an adequate response, they might be tempted to think that there doesn't exist an adequate response and make an argument from incredulity or an argument from ignorance and say that science can't explain it, therefore God, which is a fallacy, but it happens quite a bit. Be prepared to concede ignorance, like I was just saying, if you don't know the answer to something. But don't let your partner commit that fallacy of saying an appeal to ignorance is where they say, I don't understand how this could have happened, therefore God did it. Appeal to incredulity is when somebody says, the explanation that you just gave me seems too far-fetched, and therefore I don't believe it, and therefore God did it. This is what I was talking about a little bit ago as far as asking lots of questions and asking nudging questions and letting them do most of the talking. The Socratic method, it's a little more complicated than this, but it's basically just being persistently almost annoying in question asking, and you can phrase things as statements or you can phrase them as questions, And the preferred way, if you're going to do it this way, is to ask questions. Your statements should end with a question mark when you're having these sorts of discussions. Like, for example, if somebody commits a fallacy while they're telling you what they believe, instead of saying, well, that's a fallacy and this is why, and explaining it, you can say, well, doesn't that blah, 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 and ask it as a question, and then they'll try to answer it and explain to you why it does make sense, and hopefully in the process of doing that, see that in fact it doesn't make sense. Keep your voice even. This is a emotional topic for a lot of people. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but if you speak evenly and softly, and it helps people not get upset. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Keep your partner on topic. If you're just having an informal discussion and they want to talk about something else, that's up to you. It's totally fine. But if you want to talk about religion and they go off on a tangent about Jesus saving your soul or something like that, you can say, I'm not really interested in a sermon. And if I wanted that, I would go to a church where they're good at it, and I'm not interested. But and take notes. For some reason, a lot of people have this idea that it's rude to take notes during a discussion like this, but there's good reasons for doing that. If you want to follow up, if you want to be able to remember the resources that you suggested, so that you can send them to them later, it's perfectly fine to do that. And then, like I said, follow up with these additional resources with links to web resources and so on. So let's talk about what a discussion... I'm sorry I'm kind of speeding through this. This is usually a 90-minute talk. So let's talk a little bit about what a discussion looks like, with some credit to J.T. Eberhard for these points. The first question you need to ask when you're starting a discussion with somebody is, can you envision anything that will change your mind? If you're talking to somebody who has had 60 years of practice believing the same thing, our brains are plastic and they form these pathways, and they're reinforced over time the more you believe the same thing and the more you act in the same ways. And for some people, after a certain point, they are literally physically unable to change their mind. Their brains just don't reprogram that way. If somebody is brand new to a religion, it's much easier to poke the holes in it and show them that it's wrong. But if somebody's been doing it for their whole lives, just understand that they might not be capable. And in that case, it really is a waste of your time. If one of the reasons that the person is using to explain why they believe is shown to be wrong, will you agree to stop using it with everyone? And if somebody is intellectually honest, if they understand that a reason that they believe is incorrect, they should understand that there is not a reason for them to continue using it with other people, not just in this discussion, but with any discussion about it, unless they are being intellectually dishonest. So that should be a point. Do you agree to follow some basic rules for discussion? Like, for example, let's talk about one reason at a time and not just jump from reason to reason like I was talking about before. Provide evidence for the positions that you have. Some people just say, well, I don't need evidence. And it's like, why not? Because this is what I believe. That's not the question that I asked. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. Don't move to a new reason or a new question if something that you relied upon in your previous setup was explained to you why it's incorrect, and so on. As I said a minute ago, discussion is not a sermon on their part or a lecture on your part. It's questions and answers back and forth. And follow these rules yourself. If they change your mind about something as far as a point that you had, that they explain why it's incorrect, as far as what Christians believe or something like that, make sure that you stop using that argument and so on too. So let's look a little bit about what's going on when somebody believes something. There's a distinction between belief versus knowledge, and a lot of times believers will think that these are synonymous and use them interchangeably, but they're not. I actually do a whole talk about epistemology that explores this in more detail, but to boil that hour-long talk down to one sentence, if you believe something, that doesn't mean that it's a fact. It doesn't mean that it's knowledge, that it counts as knowledge. Belief is a necessary condition of knowledge, but you also have to be able to justify your belief, and your belief has to, in fact, be true in the universe before it counts as something that you know And a lot of times Christians, and I'm picking on Christians in this talk, but they're the most common in the United States as far as religious people. But people who are religious will tend to say things like, well, I know that Jesus loves me. And that's a belief. And you can say that. You can say, well, actually, that's a belief that you have. Or you can say, isn't that just something you believe? I mean, do you actually know that? And this is the question to ask. That may be your belief, but is it actually true? That helps separate out belief versus knowledge. Neil deGrasse Tyson has a great bit about this on YouTube. He says, one of the best questions that you can ask is, how do you know that? Or I actually prefer to word it this way, why do you believe that? It's a why question that makes them need to therefore provide a reasoning for what they believe or justification. And a really important point is to explain why they believe, not what they believe. The way that our brains work, sometimes when we're faced with a question that's tricky, we'll kind of default to a slightly different question that's easier to answer without even noticing it. And this comes up quite a bit. If you're asking somebody why they believe what they believe, often they will just tell you something else that they believe, or maybe even a clarifying point about that, but that's not answering the question about why it is that they believe that. Are you guys familiar with the outsider test for faith from John Loftus? I'm not sure if he was the first person to come up with this or if he was just the first person to formalize it, but the outsider test for faith is basically just looking at all religions the same way that you look at your religion. The way that he words it, tell believers to examine their faith critically, and most of the time they will say they already do, but tell them to subject their own faith to the same level of skepticism they use when examining the other religious faiths they reject, and that will get their attention. So it's basically the question of what would it take to convince you that any religion is true, not just that your religion is true. People have a tendency to think that their religion is the one true religion, all other religions are myths, and if you can help them understand that all religions are on kind of the same playing field there, and they just happen to believe this one because of the culture that they were raised in, that can be a big step toward understanding your point. So in practice of having these discussions, religionists often don't actually defend what they believe. They defend deism. For example, if you're talking to somebody who's Jewish, they have specific beliefs. They believe in a Messiah who's going to come. They believe that God created the world and God created all these different things, and that there is one God and not multiple gods and so on. But if you ask them why they believe what they believe, often they'll say, well, something can't come from nothing. Something had to spark the Big Bang. That's actually an argument for deism. That's not an argument for Judaism. And if somebody claims to be Jewish, they should be able to justify the specifics of what they believe. And if they can't do that, that's a good sign that maybe they shouldn't believe that. It is. The Ten Commandments, a lot of people in the Abrahamic religions will insist that these are overwhelmingly important, that these are the basis of religious belief and that everybody should follow them, that we should have monuments to them in front of our courthouses, which is something we deal with at American Atheists quite a bit. If they are that important to religious people and the basis of everything that they believe, one thing that I like to do, and this is kind of snarky, is to ask them to list them, because in my experience, maybe 1% of religious people are able to do that. I've read the Bible probably 20 times, and it's my experience that most people who claim to be extremely religious, even some pastors that I know, have not read the Bible. And it's inexcusable, I think. We'll come back to a little bit about that Ten Commandments here in a little bit. If somebody is justifying to you why they believe the Bible, ask them, why don't you believe the Quran, or why don't you believe the Book of Mormon? If their reasoning for believing it is that it was inspired by God, which there's no good evidence that it was, well, Muslims claim that the Quran was inspired by God. Mormons believe that an angel helped Joseph Smith with writing the Book of Mormon. And so allegedly, those books have just as much justification for belief as the Bible. So there's really no reason that they should, if their reason for believing it is that it was inspired by God, disbelieve these other books if they accept the Bible. So you can point that out to them. Are you guys familiar with the concept of parsimony? It's also called Occam's razor, after William of Ockham, who formalized it in 1327, I think. Basically, parsimony is, I think, probably the most important concept in science. It basically just says that you're supposed to use economy of assumptions in your reasoning. So the simplest explanation tends to be the right one. If you don't have excellent evidence that something is more complicated than it appears to be, the simpler explanation is probably right, just as far as statistical probability. One thing to keep in mind is that the social science of history is not amenable to repeat experiment. It's subject to the problem of induction. We can only rely on the evidence that we have to reconstruct something that happened in the past, and we can turn out to be wrong about things, but that goes both ways. Religious people can also be wrong about things. For miracle claims, if they say that they know that, I'll just pick on Christianity again, that Christianity is true because they were visited by an angel after a car accident or something, you can point out to them that these experiences are not unique to Christian followers, that miracles happen in all cultures. And I mean, there are Indian newspapers that regularly report on miracles of faith healings in India, and that's not proof that those gods exist any more than your mother's cancer going into remission or something being proof that their God exists. It's just not tied that way. And I talked a little bit about this before as far as belief versus identity and emotions playing a key factor in this. A lot of people tie up their belief in their identity and they kind of conflate the two. There's a kind of a good parallel here with gay rights. People who are especially interested in gay rights, if they are also gay, it's when you are discussing why ethically, just using philosophical arguments, there should be rights for gay marriage. It is personal for a gay person because it's part of who they are. And when you start arguing with them about the philosophical reasons that rights should or should not apply to certain groups of people, you are attacking them. And it is their identity that you're attacking. And it's the same thing with religious people. It's not that you are attacking Christianity or that you're discussing Christianity. If you're talking to a Christian, it's a Christian. That's the key word there, not just Christianity. And if you can help them understand that those are distinct things, who they are and what they believe, it can be helpful in them seeing that first step of my religion is one of many, not my religion is the one true religion and all other religions are myth. So let's talk about blasphemy. Blasphemy is an important part of this entire presentation. I'm going to go ahead and claim that it's the most important difference between people who do not have a concept of the supernatural or don't believe in it and people who do. The reason for that is that we don't have this idea of blasphemy. Blasphemy is disrespecting something divine, and because we don't believe in anything divine, it doesn't apply to us. But it's very, very important as far as emotional responses from religious people and being able to talk about these things. Here it is. Blasphemy is the act of insulting or showing contempt or lack of reverence for a god or sacred thing. Blasphemy is at the foundation of the three Abrahamic religions. It's very important, just to bring up the Ten Commandments again. Don't have any other gods before me. I mean, obviously, it's disrespectful to God to worship some other god. Don't have graven images of me. It's disrespectful to God to do that. Don't take God's name in vain. That's extremely obviously blasphemous. Keep the Sabbath holy. Again, if you have something holy, then it's blasphemous to disrespect it. Honor your parents. It's something that God wants you to honor, and if you disrespect that, you're disobeying God. These are, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal. These are things that are good advice, but because they're important to God, according to Abrahamic religion, that makes them blasphemous, not just immoral to break those. it could be argued that all 10 commandments really do that just because they're important to God. Matthew 26 talks about the reason that Jesus was arrested and killed, and it was because, according to Judaism, it's hugely blasphemous to claim the attributes of a deity or claim to be a god. So this is at the core of the Jesus story. Do you guys know what a cardinal sin is versus, or a mortal sin, versus an eternal sin? The Catholics in the room probably do. An eternal sin is a sin that if you commit, you can never be redeemed for that, no matter how much you ask for forgiveness. If you are introduced to the idea of the Holy Spirit and you blaspheme the Holy Spirit according to Catholicism, you will go to hell. It doesn't matter if you become a Christian later. So it's that important to Christianity. In Christianity and Islam, Judaism kind of encourages questioning. It's part of the process. But in Christianity and Islam, just doubting itself, thought crimes, is itself blasphemous. So we're going to talk about what exactly happens in your brain neurologically when people experience blasphemy, or when religious people do. There's this process called amygdala hijacking. This comes from research by Daniel Goleman, who's a psychologist at Harvard, and working with Joseph Ledoux, who's a neuroscientist at NYU, in their respective books, Emotional Intelligence and Synaptic Self. Amygdala hijacking is basically the process that happens in your brain when somebody blasphemes, and what happens with that. There's 3 signs that this is taking place, that if you recognize this happening during a discussion, you need to be aware of it. If somebody has a strong emotional reaction, they just suddenly get very emotional. It happens very suddenly, and later they realize, perhaps after you point it out to them, that that reaction was disproportionate to just having a discussion about religion. There's no danger, there's no reason to get extremely upset, but that's what they did. Surprise is very important in this process of amygdala hijacking. If you prep the person that you're about to offend that you're going to be doing that, then you're much less likely to trigger amygdala hijacking. This is the reason that jokes aren't funny the second time you hear them, because you know what's coming. Horror movies are not scary the second time, because when the monster jumps out of the closet, you know it's about to happen. If you tell the person you're talking to, now, I don't mean to offend you, but what I'm about to say might upset you. If you say that, you're much less likely to cause this process. Desensitization is a very important part of blasphemy, and there are parallels here to treating phobias clinically. There's a research from Joseph Wolpe in the 1950s who made huge advances in clinical advancements in treatment of this stuff. There really wasn't a good way to treat phobias before that, but the process is it's a 13-step process, and it's a systematic increasing exposure that desensitizes you. Just to use arachnophobia, irrational fear of spiders, as an example, the 13 steps are to think of a spider and in a controlled, safe setting like a clinician's office. And for some people, that is enough to freak them out. That is enough to cause amygdala hijacking. Once you are at the point in the process where you can comfortably do that without freaking out, then you move on to step 2, which is to look at a cartoon or a silly drawing of a spider. Once you can do that comfortably, then you look at a realistic drawing of a spider, then a photo, then you have an empty spider's web in person, then you touch the spider's web in person, then you look at a real spider in a box, then you hold the box, then you look at a spider not in a box, across the room, then halfway across the room, then up close, then you have it crawl on something you're holding, and then you have it crawl on your hand. And if you do those one step at a time, slowly, and the way that you are able to do each one without freaking out before you move on to the next one, and it's going to be uncomfortable at first, but as you keep doing it, you'll be desensitized. Once you can have a spider crawl on your hand, you're cured of arachnophobia at that point. And I mean, unless they're venomous, spiders are not dangerous. It's an irrational fear to be afraid of them if you know that it's a species that isn't venomous. So there's no reason to be afraid, and this helps you understand that. So as far as what amygdala hijacking actually looks like, let's see if I can get my laser pointer to work. Okay, so normally the way this works, I'll try to stay talking to the mic here. You have input that comes into your brain through one of your sensory organs, like the eye, for example, in this case. And it goes to the thalamus, which is kind of the air traffic controller of the brain. It decides where to send signals that come in. It does a lot of other things too, but that's relevant to this part. And then if it's visual input, it sends it to the visual cortex in the back of the brain, which is part of the neocortex, and processes it there. And it sends it to the amygdala here for emotional response. It adds in that aspect of it. And then from there, it routes to action. In amygdala hijacking, what happens is you have input. If you see something blasphemous, it'll come in to the thalamus. The thalamus will realize that this is not okay, that this is inappropriate, and it will skip the neocortex part of the brain and go directly to the amygdala. And the thing to keep in mind here is that you have input, thalamus, emotional response directly. At no point in that process is the neocortex the newest part of the brain, the part of the brain that does logical thinking, that does language, that does judgment of risk-reward ratios, the part of the brain that makes us human and not fish. At no point is that consulted in this process. So what that means is if somebody is extremely insulted and they get really emotional, they are physically unable to think logically about what you're saying, because the part of the brain that does logic is not part of that equation. Okay, Goleman, who does research on this, says emotions make us pay attention right now, this is urgent, and give us an immediate action plan without having to think twice. The emotional component evolved very early. The brain's evolved from the inside out. So this is, the brain stem down here is the oldest part, and then this part, and then it just grew outward from there. Do I eat it or does it eat me? The emotional response can take over the rest of the brain in a millisecond if threatened. Amygdala hijacking is the same process that happens, the fight or flight response, it's called. If, say, you're swimming and a shark jumps out of the water, you're going to have an emotional response to that. It's the same exact process in your brain that is going on here. So when somebody feels attacked, it's not just a metaphor. That's actually how they feel. It's the same process in the brain. Amygdala hijacking triggers a release of peptides and hormones. Adrenaline is the main one. It prepares you for what Goleman calls violent muscular action. Adrenaline being the key one here. It speeds up your heart rate and your breathing. Your bronchi dilate, your pupils contract, your blood vessels and your muscles dilate, and in extreme cases you lose control of your bladder. And it's just, when you freak out, this is what's happening. So the key word when you're talking about blasphemy, and I touched on this earlier, is sheltered. It's entirely possible as a Christian in the United States to go through your entire life never really interacting with someone else who isn't Christian. Christians have their own daycares, they have their own K through 12 private schools, they have their own colleges, they have their own TV channels and TV networks, they have their own radio stations, they have their own music genres, they have their own book genres, they have their own summer camps, and they have their own hospitals, and they have their own retirement homes. And I mean, you could really go from birth to death with never interacting with somebody who isn't Christian without really a lot of effort in this country, in certain geographical areas anyway. But like I was talking about earlier with arachnophobia, the way to cure this process of amygdala hijacking is through exposure and desensitization. So if it's the first time or one of only a few times in their life that a religious person sees the word atheist, for some people who are extremely sheltered, that can be enough to trigger this response. If you're setting up a sign or something for an Ask an Atheist tabling event. For some people, that will make them extremely upset just to be aware of that word. At American Atheists, we often put up billboards and things like that, and it's not unusual for billboard companies to refuse to run them because they know that people will deface them and write them angry letters and boycott them, just because even if they don't say anything negative, if they say, atheist, you're not alone, just like that. There's nothing offensive about that, but it pisses people off to see the word and just be reminded that atheists exist. A main point that I want to make is that as an atheist, you have been desensitized already. You are accustomed to talking about the idea that the Jesus story is a myth, the idea that atheists exist, the idea that God perhaps didn't create all life. And if you're not desensitized to these things, if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody who hasn't been, there's a disconnect there in what you are comfortable saying that you think is not disrespectful and what they are comfortable hearing that they think is not disrespectful. And you need to be very aware of that disconnect. Like I was saying earlier about the arachnophobia steps, if you skip steps, if you jump from the cartoon spider drawing to having a spider on your hand, you're going to freak out. You're not ready for that. So when you're talking to somebody, you need to be very aware of things like your language and just related topics like that might be skipping steps for them, even if you don't see the distinction. That's pretty much what I was just going over. Cursing is a good one, a good example of this. If they're not used to ever hearing those words and you just use them as part of your, just to inject passion into what you're saying, it can be extremely offensive and upsetting for them and make them shut down logically, literally. In Judaism, just as one example, you're not supposed to say or write the word God or God's name because it's forbidden in Judaism. They say Hashem, which means the name, when they need to do it, and or Adonai, which means master, instead of saying Yahweh, which is his actual name. So if you're talking about God and you say Yahweh for an extremely sheltered Jewish person, that might seriously piss them off. Now, this is a serious one, though, as far as being aware of your clothing, especially with Orthodox Jews and with extremely fundamentalist Muslims. If you're doing a tabling event and you have a woman whose face isn't covered or is wearing shorts, this can seriously piss off a fundamentalist Muslim to the point that they are unable physically to engage with you logically. It's just something to be aware of. Or if you have a T-shirt that says, I'm an atheist, ask me anything, or something like that. It's happened to me. So, getting to the end of this here, blasphemy means different things to different people. It is culturally dependent. In the subculture of this group, it's okay for us to talk about God not existing. It's okay for us to say things like Jesus was not divine, or say the words God damn. That's okay. We don't freak out about it. But for other people in other subcultures, those are blasphemous things, and it's just something that we need to be aware of when we're talking to people. If you want to cause amygdala hijacking in a discussion, which there might be cases where you want to do, at American Atheists, we are secular humanists, but that's not how we identify. We identify as atheists. We are the Marines of the movement. It's very much not a problem for us to piss people off. That's our strategy, and it's just how we feel about it. We're anti-theists. But there are cases where you might want to do this gently and slowly. The more somebody has these amygdala hijackings, the less intense they will be the next time that comes up. So sometimes you want to brush against that level where they're about to freak out, but not cross that threshold. You can challenge your conversation partner, push them beyond those baby steps if you are intending to cause it. If you don't want to cause it, then there are certain other strategies that you can use to make that not happen. The main one is to just use the baby steps. Remember the phobia steps. You have to be aware, and this is also why it's so important that they do most of the talking. You have to understand where they're coming from and what level they're at as far as comfort with these things in order to be on the same level with them, or maybe one level of more blasphemy above them instead of 6. You can avoid surprises, which, remember, triggers amygdala hijacking, by preparing your conversation partner. It's really easy to do. All you have to do is just say, this might be upsetting, but, and then say it, and that's it. As long as they know it's coming, it's less likely to trigger it. And you can reassure them throughout. You can say just simply, this is an emotional topic. It's tied up in people's identity. We understand that here collectively, and I'm not doing the things that I'm doing as far as bringing up these topics to upset you, but it's necessary to talk about these things, to have a discussion about them. And so don't take it personally, and let's just talk about it. And if you just say things like that throughout, they will not get upset at you personally. And remember that these sorts of things don't happen overnight. It can take months or years or decades for a person to be comfortable with this stuff and to move from fundamentalist to cafeterian to deist to atheist. Don't get frustrated if you don't make much progress in the first discussion or the 5th discussion. It takes time. Yeah, that is the end of the informal debates part, which is what I'm doing today. And I'm happy to take questions if you have questions. Thanks. Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi.
Is American Atheist planning a response to that twit Dana Perino on Fox News, who had the statement about she's really tired of hearing about atheists, and if they don't like it here, they should go somewhere else?
Yeah, I'm actually writing an article about it right now. It'll be posted on atheists.org next week. But yeah, that's completely unacceptable. We have every right to be here. The Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, and that was totally inappropriate editorialization on a news station.
Are you contacting her?
Possibly. I'm going to make sure that she reads it. I'm probably not going to call her directly about it, but I'll send it to her. So
I'll find the number for you.
I have her number, actually, but thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You mentioned near the end fundamentalism or fundamentalist, and I was wondering if there is really any hope at all for a bridge building between the extremes in our society, particularly religious fundamentalism. But there is fundamentalism in other areas too, and I personally have found ambivalence with regards to my being certain about anything. I think certitude has a danger of all its own. If you care to comment on that,
Sure.
I'd appreciate it.
One of the things that happens with fundamentalism is that people take ideologies or beliefs and they tie them in with their identity, and that's what's going on. They become that, as opposed to just this is something that they think is right but could be wrong about. And if you can help somebody move in the direction of seeing that their point of view is a point of view and not the only one that matters, then you can make progress. Some people are physically incapable of doing that, but I like to be hopeful about it and say that if people are willing to discuss things with you in a nice way, that there's room for progress. Some people are not willing to discuss it. They just say, I'm right and you're wrong, and if you disagree with me, you're going to hell, or if you disagree with me, then you should leave the country or whatever. There's really not any practical way that we can build bridges with people like that, like Fred Phelps of the Westboro Baptist Church. There's just no way. He's gone, you know. But you know, somebody like Dan Barker, for example, he was a preacher for years, speaking in tongues even, and very hardcore belief. but he was able to move out of that. He's also a brilliant guy who has a good brain that's capable of this sort of thing. But I think it just depends on the person. On a case-by-case basis, you have to evaluate that. Sure.
Hi, thank you for coming and the presentation. I just want to make a comment about parsimony,
Yes.
Occam's razor. I think it's dangerous to think that the simplest solution is to be preferred. I'd rather, because what could be simpler than just thinking, well, God did it. So in this context, maybe an alternate definition would be better, like the explanation that requires the fewest outside influences is to be preferred.
Well, God did it is actually not a simple explanation at all.
Simple-minded, anyway.
Yeah,
But
simple,
which could be confused with simplest.
But to think of something that powerful, that's assuming quite a bit that there exists something that is capable of doing that. There's this argument that religious people use sometimes that God must be bigger and more powerful and than the universe itself, because only something bigger and better than something can create something else, and whatever they create is always going to be less complicated and less intense and less interesting than they are. But that's not true. We do have explanations for simple processes creating complicated things, like evolution is a perfect example. But I still think parsimony applies. It's not saying that the simplest answer is necessarily right. It's just saying that unless we have evidence that it's not right, if all else being equal, it's more likely to be right just statistically.
I guess I'm just trying to be careful about the word simple.
Yeah, simple and easy are not necessarily the same thing. It's easy to believe in God. It's not simple because you're ignoring a lot of information. To do that.
I wonder if you have any advice for teacher in this situation. My wife has taught Italian in the past. In the beginning of the class, they learn a few simple words for hi, hello, how are you, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in one class, in the first class, she had a Muslim student who was unable to interact with the women in the class, and he got very nervous and was unable to complete the course because his religion taught him that was a sin to interact with a woman not in his family. And I wonder if you have any advice for teachers in that kind of situation, that they could somehow relieve the student of this, the tremendous anxiety. I'm
not an expert in this, but if I were faced with this situation, if somebody emailed me about it or asked me at a talk, I would say that a parent-teacher conference would probably be a good start, and just to say, we're having this problem, and your child is taking their religion so seriously that they're unable to do this. If it's not at the college level, if it is at the college level, I would say that just talking to the student directly and saying that if your religion is stopping you from being able to do this class, you need to make a decision between what you value more, learning and educating yourself and growing as a person, or boxing yourself into these rules. And sometimes people will choose one, or sometimes people will choose the other. The same thing happens when you have a religious friend and you become an atheist. They have to decide, do I want to value my religion more? That says in 2 Peter 6:13, do I want to not yoke with unbelievers and not be friends with them? Is that more important to me than my friendship with you? And some people will make that choice, and other people will make the other choice. And it's unfortunate when that happens, but if somebody is unwilling to bend, I think there's not a lot that we can do except try to talk them out of it.
Hi, my name is Richard, and I'm actually a dual citizen. I'm Israeli and American, and I also travel in the Arab Middle East quite a bit. But I think, and of course lived here most of my life, but I would say my main concern is when people use religion to enforce fundamental beliefs. That seems to be one of our problems today, that religions, I look at religion mainly to provide some sort of ethical standards. But unfortunately, even in this day in modern, the 21st century, you'd think the force of religion would be weakened in terms of its fundamentalism, but it's not. That seems to be an issue.
It is in certain ways. In certain parts of the world, it isn't for sure, and it grows and falls just depending on lots of cultural factors and historical factors. But I think overall, I mean, there are 1 billion people now who consider themselves not religious, 1/7 of the world's population, which 500 years ago was absolutely not the case. Fundamentalism is an extreme problem in many, many countries. Norway and Sweden probably not, but here and in Argentina or Brazil, one of those two that has extremely strict abortion laws and so on. I'm sorry?
Chile.
Oh, Chile, okay. Yeah, I mean, fundamentalism is a serious problem, and I don't know that it's one that is going to be solved anytime soon. Educating people, ignorance is what causes fundamentalism. Lack of exposure to other cultures is what causes fundamentalism. If, as a child, or even older than that, if you're exposed to many different cultures, you will be less inclined to think that your one is the best one or the only one that matters. And as the world gets smaller, just through the internet and things like that, I just think over time less likely to see this as a problem. But it is a problem now, and I hope getting better. Yeah.
This is really step one, and I should know this as an atheist, but I don't know a convincing answer to one that said, so how did it all begin? And I do the Darwin theory and this, but there's something not convincing that I'm doing, and I really don't know how it all began. Is there truly an answer? I mean, there are many answers. We don't necessarily have proof which one is the right one. All right, that's where I've been.
Yeah. And it's okay to say that you don't know, and science doesn't know. We have theories that fit all of the evidence so far, but the main point is that, and it's called an argument from ignorance in logic, just because we don't know the answer to something doesn't mean positively that God did it. All it means is we don't know yet. And usually my response to that is just, we have some of the brightest people in the world working on it, and we're going to figure it out. Every time so far that we've thought God did something and then studied it, we found out that God didn't do it, and there's a natural process that's a good explanation. And there's no reason to think that that is not going to continue to be true for things we just haven't yet explained. There might be things, actually I was just having this conversation earlier today, there might be things that we may never be able to explain just because the early conditions of the universe, the laws of physics start to be very, very different, and they break down to the point that we can't make predictions using math anymore. And at that point, it's impossible for us to say with any degree of certainty what really happened. So we might never know, but that doesn't mean that God did it. That just means we don't know. And that's the most intellectually honest answer. As far as where it all began, if you're having that discussion with somebody, you need to clarify or ask them to clarify, do you mean how life began, how the universe began? Those are two very different fields. And a lot of people mix up evolution, which is the process of a change in the frequency of alleles from generation to generation within a gene pool that leads to speciation, with where life started, which is abiogenesis, is the current thinking on that. Evolution just explains the variety of life. It doesn't explain how life started. It's a different field and a different question, and we don't actually know the answer, but that doesn't mean that God did it any more than 3,000 years ago when we didn't know what caused lightning, that God did it. We just didn't know yet.
Building on what Tom said, I have a hard time hearing, so I missed everything you said about parsimony.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
But I will tell you that I looked at it and I'm like, that means cheap, that means frugal. So I kind of went back to Occam's razor, which is given two hypotheses, the one with the least number of assumptions is the one that should be chosen, and assumptions being the key word in any kind of a talk like that. The other thing is that I just wanted to put in a plug for the American Atheists in April, because I've gone to 2 American Atheist conventions, and they're amazing. They're always held on Easter weekend. And this year, yes, that's right. I don't think you have plans. And this year it's going to be in Salt Lake City, so we need to show the Mormons in great force that we exist. So I like to go because I like to see 1,000 other people that are also living within reason, and they always have great speakers. And I'm going to go see the Great Salt Lake and the copper mines. So
Cool. Yeah.
so make your plans for the American Atheist Convention.
Thanks. If I could just spend 30 seconds on that while we're on topic. We have been to Salt Lake City before, but it was like 20 years ago. And what we're trying to do this time, this is really the first time that the atheists movement has reached out to Mormons, to ex-Mormons, I should say. There's I don't know if I want to say it's a problem, but there is a fact that a lot of people who were raised Mormon but no longer believe in God still refer themselves in the setting of Mormonism. They call themselves ex-Mormons. They don't call themselves atheists. And part of what we want to do is help them make that transition to seeing themselves as part of our community, not just not a part of that community anymore, and have these friends and these experiences. One thing that we're also trying to do to help normalize atheism and help people understand that it's a common thing, that people are probably atheists even if they don't talk about it a lot. All 4 of our keynote speakers this year have never before addressed an atheist audience. Chris Cluey, who's an NFL football player, he is an atheist, but will be his first time speaking about atheism. Barbara Hillary, who's an adventurer, she's a wonderful 83-year-old woman who has visited both poles, and she's currently planning her next expedition. The first time she went to the North Pole, she was 75. And she's the first African-American woman to visit the North Pole and the only black woman to visit both poles. She's really cool. And we have Mark White, who's the bass player of the band The Spin Doctors, and Denise Shapley, who is the $1 million grand prize winner of the TV show Survivor Philippines. And she's also a sex therapist, and she's really cool. And then we've got 30 other amazing speakers, and I highly recommend you check it out. If you just go to atheists.org, there's all the information there. Great. Cool. Yeah, there's a costume party too.
So this talk was about trying to convince people through argument, through discussion. I know American Atheists is also very interested in encouraging people to be forthright and out about their atheism. And in some sense, those are sort of 2 strategies. And to put it a little bit more bluntly, do you think it is more important to try and convince people through logic, or to entice people through just showing an example of being an atheist is a cool thing to be, or a useful thing to be, or if you come and join our community, your life will be more exciting, more sparkling, you'll get what you want in life. But in other words, you could choose to have a 2-hour-long discussion with someone about the origin of life and the relevance of other religions, not all being true at the same time. Or you could just have a brief conversation and then meet your sparkling significant other and pop into your Jaguar and drive off. And that might be actually more convincing to your audience. I'm just sort of wondering, which you think is more important, the emotional or the logical?
I think it completely depends on the person that you're trying to help understand. For many people, knowledge and truth are something that they do value and something that is very important to them. And for those people, explaining these things logically and helping lessen ignorance is going to be the way to help them see atheism in a more positive light, especially if they have the impression that atheists is a synonym for Satanist or something like that, and you can just correct misinformation. I think there's very much a place for both strategies. I wouldn't say one is more important to the other. It just depends on who you're talking to. If somebody really values community and a place to feel welcome, a different type of approach is going to be much more effective with that person. And they're not mutually exclusive. In a lot of community events related to atheism, they talk about logical things, and you can combine them in that way. One of our three purposes in our mission statement at American Atheists is to provide a sense of community for atheists. And we have 130 plus affiliate groups around the country that meet once a week. And similar to this, they have talks and stuff and go to bars and chat with each other. It is an important part of being an atheist and living in this country is that we're a minority. And in a lot of places, people might think that they're the only atheist. I don't know if you know who Debbie Goddard is. She works for the Center for Inquiry. She really, this is just funny, when she was in 7th grade, she had the idea of atheism. She went to a Catholic school, and she was sitting in bed the night that it came to her that there might not be a God. And she was saying, like, oh my gosh, this is going to change everything. I'm going to go to school tomorrow, and I'm going to tell the teachers, and they're going to have to talk to the priests, and I'm going to get a big award. And she thought it was this new idea. And it's just people who are isolated like that and sheltered in that way, it's kind of sad because they don't have that sense of community that there are millions of people who don't believe in God in this country. And by helping people understand that they can join our community, not just leave another community, is a main goal that we have.
Just a comment, and then talk about the Muslim issue. You made a comment, Dave, about ex-Mormons,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're standing against something in a sense of what they were. I just make the comment that the word atheists is the same kind of word. I mean, it's sort of a negative, not a positive. To get to the Muslim issue, I think that the comment from the Israeli citizen and the comment from the teacher are quite interesting, because it seems to me that if you have the student in your class who can't learn because of the male-female issue, that's an opportunity for the engagement like you're talking about. Not to say, I would have to disagree. You said just tell him he has to take the class or he can't graduate or whatever. But the other question is to ask him, what would be, in your mind, a reasonable way to learn Italian and yet accept our national norm that people are equal and deserve to be in the class? So just ask him, how would he approach that problem? What would be acceptable in a sense to combine those things? That's a very different issue from the hordes of people who will not listen, because as we were talking last night, when you have a group think, it's a very different kind of conversation, because people may be reasonable as an individual but be very unreasonable as part of a group. So that's a real challenge to try to convince a group of people. But I would have to disagree with the comment about the teacher. I think the teacher would need to engage that person and ask rather than just demand.
I think that's a fair point, and like I mentioned when the question came up, I think ultimately the only way to resolve that would be to try to engage with them logically and have try to talk them into changing their mind on it. There is a space for accommodating. In fact, it's part of our legal structure. If you hire somebody, you have to make legal accommodations for their religion if they need certain days off, or if they need time to pray, or if they have certain dietary restrictions. And it's illegal to discriminate against that by not allowing those things if you can make a reasonable accommodation, the same way that it's illegal to discriminate against somebody with a physical disability and not make a reasonable accommodation. But I understand what you're saying, and I'm not sure I entirely agree. If somebody is unwilling to bend you can try to meet them halfway, but the point that we make at American Atheists is that religion is not that big of a deal. It's not that important, and it's given an improper and high status. And I wouldn't say this in that situation because I would lose my job as a teacher, but I would say that's a bullshit reason and you need to get over it. I mean, well, I'm sorry, but like, yeah, I feel bad for that person, but that's not rational to say that I'm not going to talk to this other human being because my imaginary friend says I shouldn't. That's the fact, and they might be insulted by that. Yeah, I know, but that's the truth. And if you respect somebody, you don't have to be as tactless as I just was. But if you respect somebody, in my opinion, you're honest with them. You don't soften things beyond the point of just being tact in order to make them feel better. Religion is not a force for good. It's poison. It does things like this and divides people. Yeah.
I didn't say you would divide the class into men and women.
Sure.
That's not what I said.
Mm-hmm.
How to get him to understand how he can live in the society that we are and still learn. It may not be acceptable to him.
Yeah.
The conversation, yeah, the same conversation. You have.
Right. And I would say the answer is become enculturated, which means change your point of view to match the culture that you have transported yourself into. And if you're unwilling to do that, you can isolate yourself and go to a Muslim school where they do that, or you can choose not to insert yourself into a country or a culture that you are unwilling to bend and become part of. I mean, I think there is room for the melting pot issue, but if we're going to do that, we got to remember it's a melting pot, not a stew, with different lumps that don't talk to each other. So,
all right, we're quickly running out of time here. There's 3 more people. This gentleman, April, and then the gentleman in blue, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay.
For people who read the Bible literally, what kind of experience have you had with bringing up the views of liberal Bible scholars like Bart Ehrman? Well, I don't know, you may know himself. He went from reading the Bible literally to liberal Christian to agnostic, and it started was basically textual criticism, historical arguments, etc.
I would say, for biblical literalists, in my experience, most of them have not read the Bible, and if they...
Well, that's exactly what Ehrman started finding,
right.
when he really started reading
right.
things and comparing things against... that's the entire point of textual criticism.
Mm-hmm. It is impossible to take the Bible literally if you've read it, because there are contradictions that are irreconcilable. Jesus dies on a different day depending on which gospel you read. If these were literally true accounts, one or both of them are wrong. It's just a fact. You can't have days before the sun exists.
What experience have you actually seen with people who read the Bible literally as far as bringing that stuff up with them? How often does it actually make any inroads? Or
as far as discussions, it's usually just a matter of ignorance, and I will at that point often just pull out the Bible app on my phone and just show them you can't take it literally. The people who study this say that it's impossible to do it, and if you are trying, it's probably because you just don't know what's in here and you haven't looked that closely. There are and just the Gospels are a good example of this. The traditional way that people read the Gospels are what's called vertically, which is where you start at the beginning and then you go through to the end, and then you go to the next Gospel and start at the beginning and read to the end. Reading horizontally, which is where you compare the same part of the story across all 4 Gospels, will quickly show you that they can't be taken literally because they disagree with each other. And there are many, hundreds and hundreds of examples of irreconcilable differences that if they just took the time to study or somebody told them about them, then I think they would either go into denial about it or be forced to change their mind.
I wanted to ask you a bigger question. You talk about the growth of non-believers even worldwide, but in this country, in the last 30 years, we've seen it's almost impossible, let's say, to run for president or even to run for Senate without kowtowing to the idea of a deist, of a deity. And can you reconcile those things, or what would you say about that?
I would say it's getting better. It's not great, but this is the first time that a sitting president has agreed to meet with an agnostic or atheist group. The Secular Coalition of America had a private meeting with the president last year. That has never, ever happened before. President Obama, in his first inauguration speech, mentioned non-believers, which is a huge step for recognition. We are seeing more and more out atheists in office. Barney Frank just came out as an atheist a couple of weeks ago. He's no longer in office. I wish he had done that while he was in office. I mean, he's already out as gay. You know, I think that was very cowardly of him not to be out about that too. But Juan Mendez is another great example. He's a state senator in Arizona who's an out atheist, and he's actually going to be speaking at our convention too. I think things are getting better slowly. They go in waves. When George Bush was in office, it was the other direction, and it just goes back and forth like that. But the way that I think about it is like, if you're on a ship moving from the past to the future, and you have like a grandfather clock on the ship, you have this pendulum that swings, back and forth, and it goes from the conservative side to the liberal side and back with each presidential shift. But the whole ship is moving this way. So even when it's shifted to the conservative side, as it goes farther along, it's more liberal than it was back here on the liberal side. And it just takes time. But I mean, in the 1950s, we inserted under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. We are now, just the other day, David Niossi went to the Massachusetts Supreme Court to start oral arguments about taking that out. And that's a big step, I think. Things like that are happening. It's a slow process. Anything legal is an achingly slow process. But people's minds are changing, and it's happening at a much faster rate. About 32% of people, they're called millennials, people who were born after 1980, consider themselves non-religious. And about 7% of the general population refers to themselves, identifies as atheist, which is up 500% from 2005. So we're making progress. It's just slow.
All right, this is going to be our last question.
I don't know. It's not so much a question as just a statement on, the aspect of the rise of Islam. I'm trained as a sociologist, and one of the things with some fundamentalists, not all, but a lot of them are reacting to the modernity and nationalism. In other words, it's they see their values being eroded away.
Mm-hmm.
They see their faith being under attack, and so their inclination is to rely on amygdalia, but they put it into nationalistic means. And so what happens is that it's a defense mechanism. When you put up a defense, you put up a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the amygdala, I was also trained in psychology, but part of the amygdala, we try to defend our minds against certain things that we see as destructive to our core values. And the thing is that the defense against that is to be willing to accept the other person and what they believe is true for them, but at the same token, know that you have something to talk to them about that you could find common ground on, but the basis has to be truth and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that the defense mechanism wants to go back to the tradition. I heard a saying one time, a lady was cutting a piece of bread, a pot roast. She would cut off the ends of the pot roast and throw them away. And she kept saying to herself, why do I do that? She remembered, well, gee, Mom used to do that. She called Mom up and said, Mom, why do you always throw away the best piece of pot roast? And she said, I don't know. Grandma used to do it. So I called Grandma up. And Grandma says, and he asked her, why do we throw away the best? And he goes, oh, silly, that's so it'll fit in the pan.
That's great. Just as a comment to that, that's a funny story, but I mean, this idea that what's true for you and what's true for me, and we can find common ground on things that we both agree are true. Things are a certain way in the universe, and we can disagree about what we found out so far, but God either exists or he doesn't, and the evidence so far shows that there isn't one, there's not a substantial case for one, and I think it's a dangerous path to go down to say there are things that are true for you, but not for everybody else. You can say there are things that you believe, but again, that's the belief versus knowledge thing that I was talking about. I think we have to be careful about granting to people the word truth if they're arguing for something that is not established.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. For more information, visit redbankhumanists.org or follow us on Twitter @RedBankHumanists.